first and foremost, I think it's important to mention when it comes to Kehinde Andrews, he is speaking for himself. He doesn't represent black people, and he also doesn't represent Commonwealth countries as a whole. In fact, actually, he often uses his platform to denounce ethnic minority people that disagree with him as Uncle Toms, Coons, and House Negroes. And he actually believes that those ideas, those racial slurs, I would argue, are actually anti-racist terms.
Okay, so guys, welcome back to the channel. Just a very quick introduction before we proceed into the segment that you're going to see shortly, and that is Kehinde Andrews, who is the man on the right-hand side, basically saying that Britain owed 2 to 3 trillion pounds worth of reparation revenue to the Caribbean islands. I didn't really hear him talk much about Africa. He's mostly talking about the Caribbean islands, and saying that people who don't agree with him are essentially COONs or House NEGROs. So he's racial slurring all over the place. His demands are just outrageous. You know, this is something that happened, you know, a few hundred years ago, and we must take that into account. We can't downplay it. However, Britain were not the only ones to take part in the slave trade. You know, you had the Saharan slave trade involving the Arabs that black people never talk about. We have the African slave trade that happened. There was many slave trades that happened in and around Africa. Many people took advantage of the circumstances in Africa at the time. And now, when you fast forward to 2024, you have a lot of corrupt and kleptocratic Caribbean governments alongside African governments that are selling the people out to China and Russia and India. So that is the predicament we are in. But anyway, guys, I'm going to play this segment for you so you can see some of this rough language and the conversation that led up to him using that language. And then I'm going to come with my analysis at the end.
But first of all, on the subject of reparations, Kehinde, what sort of money and amounts are we talking about?
Well, there have been some estimates for the Caribbean. It's between 3 and 14 trillion, but it really is a large amount of money because you have to imagine that slavery lasted for 300 years. Obviously, that's generated a lot of unpaid labor. There's also the trauma to account for, and really the wealth that we have today directly comes from slavery. So does the poverty that exists in places like the Caribbean and also around the former British Empire, which is what the Commonwealth really is. And so there is a massive debt that is owed if we're serious about tackling global inequality. But
3 to 14 trillion pounds. I mean, first of all, it's a very broad spectrum, never mind eye-watering amount. How's it calculated?
There's different ways to calculate it. So one of those is you can calculate the unpaid labour. One of the things you can do actually is you look at the reparations were paid after slavery to these slave owners. This was about 100 billion equivalent at the time. And there was also a 4-year period when slavery ended where we actually had to work for free for 4 years. And that's probably about another 100 billion. And that money was given to slave owners. So at the very least, there should be some kind of compensation. And I'd also point out that that money, I paid for that. My parents, my grandmother, who was only 2 generations away from slavery, paid for that through our taxation because the government had taken out such a massive loan. They didn't pay it back till 2015. So there has been reparations, it's been paid to the wrong people. So right. I'm not sure how the government can say that there's nothing owed to the actual descendants of the people who were enslaved.
And what's your message to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, you can't just, I mean, the idea you shouldn't apologise, that you don't have the debt, that you want to say Black Lives Matter and take a knee during 2020. But actually, if you want to deal with the actual problem, which is the economic inequality that slavery and empire has caused and is still with us. My family's in Jamaica in the Caribbean. There's only black people in that country because of slavery, and it's one of the poorest countries by debt in the world. If you want to actually deal with those problems, then Britain has to take responsibility for the sins that it has done in the world, and those sins are still ongoing.
Right, Kehinde, stay with us for the discussion. First of all, is Keir Starmer right, number 10, just to say, no apology, we won't be discussing reparations?
So I think it's absolutely right that we look back at British history and learn the lessons of that and discuss it and continue to engage on these issues. But I haven't been involved in the setting the agenda for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, but my understanding is that reparations are not on that agenda. What is on the agenda is growth, looking at Labour's #1 mission, but looking at growth across all the Commonwealth countries and how we can work together to get growth in all of our economies.
Inaya?
I think that first and foremost, I think it's important to mention when it comes to Kehinde Andrews, he is speaking for himself. He doesn't represent black people, and he also doesn't represent Commonwealth countries as a whole. In fact, actually, he often uses his platform to denounce ethnic minority people that disagree with him as Uncle Toms, Coons, and House Negroes. And he actually believes that those ideas, those racial slurs, I would argue, are actually anti-racist terms. But on specifically the point of reparations...
Well, I need to let him answer what you have just stated there. Kehinde, do you want to respond? Let's keep the language as sort of calm as possible, but Kehinde?
Oh, I mean, other than calling perfectly logical terms like House Negro, etc., which do actually come from political protest and are not racial slurs, that's rather accurate. Yes, there are black people, can be bad enough. Maybe the next Prime Minister who doesn't want to support reparations, who doesn't think that government should pay back reparations and support anti-racist campaigns. And I think it's perfectly reasonable in that situation, where actually I am talking about the collective of black people, the collective of the people who are harmed by the Commonwealth.
Well, you don't speak for me,
when there are black and brown people who go against those collectives, of course you should call them out.
But,
why would we not?
Well, so I'm happy that it's clarified that, you know, the things that I said about him are actually accurate. But on the specific point about reparations, I just think that when Lisa Nandy,
who's the Culture Secretary?
The Culture Secretary at the beginning of Labour's term said that the culture wars are over, I hoped that she was right, that actually we're moving away from this kind of divisive rhetoric focused on pitting identity groups against one another. And I think the only way to move beyond the culture war is to see the Labour side actually push much more firmly on those within the culture warring left that are pushing these kinds of issues. Because the reality is, what reparations means is that essentially taking money from the working poor in Britain, or from all racial backgrounds, and essentially giving it to regimes that have difficult governments and that have deep structural governance issues that have absolutely nothing also to do with the people that are alive today in the UK.
Well, Kehinde, do you want to respond to that, and then I'll ask the others?
The reality is that if you live in the UK, all of us, even and there is racial discrimination in the UK, but the standard of living here compared to somewhere like Nigeria or Jamaica is so much higher because of slavery, because of the wealth that is in this economy, because of slavery and empire. So you're already doing better living here than you would be if you were living in the former colony.
But the question is it the responsibility of those people here that Inaya has just talked about to bear the costs, the sort of costs that you're talking about? Yes, of course, there's a difference in standard of living, without a shadow of a doubt, but not for everybody here.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, for everybody. Okay. Let's take Nigeria, for example, where the average life expectancy is 54, where there are people living the kind of poverty we could never even imagine here. We benefit, all of us, me included, benefit from living here. You know, and that is because we benefit from the sin of slavery. Therefore, we have a debt to pay back to those who don't. It's that simple.
I'm of Nigerian heritage. Many of my family live in Nigeria. I find it very interesting that actually this discussion about reparations does not actually have much political cachet in Nigeria at all. It's primarily a discourse in the Caribbean, and there's particular reasons for that. But this idea that reparations is the primary issue that African individuals within Africa are thinking about in terms of their daily life and improving their economic circumstances is just not true. It's a complete distraction.
But except one thing, Munira, is that the three candidates who are going for the job of being General Secretary for the Commonwealth are all united on this issue of reparatory justice for Britain's role in slavery and colonialism. Is it something that should be discussed now politically?
I don't support it. I don't think it is the right focus, and I think we, as the British public and politicians, should be actually focusing on things like restoring our international aid budget. I think if we want to look at our global responsibilities, the fact that the previous Conservative government slashed the aid budget from 0.7% of GNI to 0.5 is where we should be focusing, and we should be looking to reinstate that so that we are helping and support and those countries around the world that are suffering from poverty, climate change and all sorts of other issues where we have a responsibility to step up and take a leadership role in the world, because it's really damaged our standing in the world.
Right. It doesn't look, Kehinde, as if there is either political or public support for the sorts of things that you are calling for, and that's important, isn't it, in this debate?
I mean, that's important, but we also need to recognize that these things aren't past. Malcolm X says, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, then that's not progress. Even if you pull it all the way out, then that's still not progress. You have to heal the wound. And the reality is that these things are not past. The wealth and the poverty are still with us. The knife is still very much in our back. And if we are serious about don't say Black Lives Matter and then say we're not going to talk about reparations, because that means everything you're saying is absolutely meaningless. Talking about growth in this context is ridiculous. You cannot explain the poverty in large parts of the former empire, which is still has probably about 1 billion people in absolute wretched poverty, without actually dealing with the historical conditions that has led to that point. These places are poor because Britain is rich, and you cannot deal with that problem if you don't repair the wound.
All right.
And so just admit that you want to have a racist government. Admit that you want to have a racist society.
Hang on.
Anyway,
and this is a point for me to apologise for some of the language that was used earlier on, because there will be many viewers that will have found it offensive. I know and understand that it might have been in some sort of context from both Inaya and Kahinda, but let's just keep, as I said, the language so that it isn't offending any of our viewers. Inaya.
Yeah, I think that what was the great thing about Britain in terms of examining its history is actually partly the abolition of slavery, but also the fact that racism within our society is incredibly taboo, and there are big social consequences for being a racist within society. So I actually think that we live in a very tolerant and accepting society for a lot of groups. And I think the problem with a lot of Kehinde and many people that argue what Kehinde argues, their arguments, is that they essentially want to reaffirm this relationship of inequality by saying that some countries can only be advanced economically or on equal standing if Britain does that, where there's no agency at all on the parts of those societies at all. They're entirely dependent on what Britain does for them economically. And I don't see how any country could actually have pride in itself, authority, and a strong citizenry when its entire identity is dependent on what Britain does for it. And just quickly on the point of development aid, I completely agree with you. Actually, we do live in a country that wants to support other countries and to help them economically. This idea that we don't
the aid budget has been cut, of course, the international aid budget.
And that's something that we can talk about, but that should not be on the basis of some of the things that Kehinde is talking about. I think most people actually do want to support countries that are facing poverty and other issues.
Guys, there you have it. Outrageous demands of $3 to $14 trillion. That would absolutely bankrupt the United Kingdom. The UK don't even have $3 to $14 trillion or pounds, to spare for Caribbean governments just to pocket the money and not care about their citizens. We've seen that even post-independence in Caribbean and African nations, we've seen that life has only got worse after independence. And during colonialism, life was actually better. I covered this about a week ago, and I basically spoke about how Nigeria, I used that country as a reference point, only got worse after 1960. Post-1960, 1st of October, when Nigeria established independence, life has only got worse. The country is in political, social and economic turmoil. They're on the brink of a civil war. Population explosion has gone through the roof. As the guy said in the video, Kehinde, he said that the average life expectancy is in its 50s. And that's all because of disastrous economic policies that the government implement domestically. That's the reason why. Large scales of corruption alongside poor trading choices and just not making enough revenue for the country. And we've even seen Nigeria, let's just use as an example again, hit hyperinflation rate. This is absolutely terrible. I do not believe 3 to 14 trillion is going to help anything there. It's only going to make the governments in those nations richer, and the people won't even see a penny. I can bet you any money. So 3 to 14 trillion dollars is not something that I believe will happen even in my lifetime. But I do believe that Caribbean alongside African governments simply need to stand up and do better. Stop selling the country out to the highest bidder. Actually help the citizens. Implement policies that's going to help the citizens in the long run. And have a mindset of care and responsibility instead of being selfish and pocketing all the money and only caring about yourselves, which is political nepotism at its finest. So yeah, guys. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.